There's a piece of jewelry sitting in a private home somewhere in the world right now. No museum displays it. No camera has ever captured it. No auction house has ever touched it. It is a sapphire pendant surrounded by diamonds, and it has been in the same family for over 100 years, passed down silently from generation to generation. The secret twin of one of the most iconic objects in cinema history. The woman who wore it survived one of the deadliest nights in maritime history. The man who gave it to her did not. And when James Cameron built the heart of his 1997 masterpiece around a fictional necklace, very much like it, billions of people wept in theaters around the world without ever knowing that the real thing existed and that the real story behind it was, in nearly every way, more devastating than anything Hollywood invented. Before we pull back the curtain on every secret this ship has been keeping for over a century, if stories like this pull you in and you never want to miss what comes next, subscribe to the channel right now, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. Because what you are about to hear is going to change the way you think about Titanic forever. Everyone who has ever seen James Cameron's 1997 film knows the broad architecture of it. Boy meets girl. Boy and girl fall in love across a wall of class and money. Ship hits iceberg. Love survives, but only barely, and only in memory. It is a story so emotionally efficient, so mechanically precise in how it holds your attention, that it is easy to forget how much of it is real and how much of it is invention. Cameron himself has always been clear that Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bucketer are fictional characters, vessels he created to walk the audience through a documented catastrophe. But the choice to anchor a fictional love story to a real disaster did something strange and lasting to our collective memory. It blurred the lines so completely that many people today are still not certain where history ends and Hollywood begins. That uncertainty is exactly where the most extraordinary stories hide. Let's start with the necklace. In the film, it is called the Heart of the Ocean, a massive blue diamond once belonging to Louis XVI of France, given to Rose by her cold and controlling fiancé, Cal, and ultimately thrown into the North Atlantic by an elderly Rose at the film's end. It is pure fiction from start to finish. But the real sapphire pendant, the one sitting quietly in a family's possession right now, belongs to a history far stranger than anything on that screen. A man named Henry Morley was 38 years old in April 1912. He had a wife back in England. He had a respectable name in Worcester where he ran a confectionery business, and he had made a decision that would cost him everything. He was in love with Kate Phillips, a 19-year-old former employee of his shop, and the two of them had resolved to disappear together, to book passage to America under false names and start lives that no one in England would ever know about. They boarded the Titanic as Marshall and Kate Marshall. No one aboard the ship knew who they really were. Henry had given Kate a sapphire and diamond pendant, a physical declaration of everything they were fleeing toward. When the iceberg struck in the early hours of April 15th, the crowds on the deck separated them. Henry did not survive. Kate did, and she carried that pendant with her off the ship, into the lifeboats, across the cold Atlantic, and eventually back to a life in England that no doubt looked nothing like the one she had imagined. She later gave birth to a daughter, Henry's child, a daughter she named Ellen. Ellen grew up, never having met her father, and the necklace passed down through the family, from Kate to Ellen and beyond, where it remains to this day, a tangible object from a real tragedy that the world has spent over a century revisiting through fiction. So when you watch the final scene of the film, when old Rose stands at the stern of the research vessel and lets the jewel fall into the black water, remember that the real one never went anywhere near the ocean. It stayed on land. It stayed with the people who loved the man who gave it. Now the film handles some of its real historical characters with surprising accuracy and others with creative liberties that angered people who knew better. The question of how and where Captain Edward Smith died, for example, remains genuinely contested. The film shows him entering the bridge and gripping the wheel as water crashes in. based partly on the account of Philadelphia banker Robert Daniel, who claimed he saw Smith on the bridge just before the ship made its final plunge. But other survivors reported seeing Smith in the water, suggesting he may have jumped. No one knows for certain, and historians have been debating this for over 100 years. What is not in dispute is that he went down with the ship. What is equally undisputed is the strange biographical detail that ties him to history beyond the disaster. Captain Smith walked the streets of Rio de Janeiro in 1891, more than 2 decades before he became the most famous name in maritime catastrophe. Charles Lightoller, the most senior officer to survive the sinking, has a Brazilian connection of his own. In 1889, as a young apprentice sailor, Lightoller arrived in Brazil and found himself present at one of the most significant political moments in the country's history. Standing at port, he heard the first rumors of the proclamation of the Republic. A man who would one day command order on a sinking ship in the middle of the North Atlantic was there, as a teenager, absorbing the echoes of a country remaking itself. These connections between the Titanic and Brazil run deep and strange. An Austrian survivor named Anton Kink escaped the disaster in 1912 and eventually made his way to Brazil, where he lived and worked in agriculture for 15 years, longer than any other Titanic survivor on record spent in Brazilian territory. There was also a second-class passenger named José de Brito, a Portuguese man whose final destination was supposed to be Brazil, a man who boarded the Titanic with a new life ahead of him. And the descendants of a Titanic passenger named Manuel Stanislao live today in São Paulo, carrying in their family tree the weight of a night that most of the world knows only through a movie. But let's talk about the movie itself for a moment, because the story of how it got made is in certain ways as improbable as anything that happened in April 1912. James Cameron had become known in Hollywood as a technically brilliant, brutally demanding director whose projects consistently went over budget. By the time Titanic entered production in 1996, the original budget of somewhere between $100 and $110 million had already started to expand. By the time shooting wrapped, the budget had doubled and the production had consumed 160 days instead of the planned 138. The final production budget reached $200 million, a record at the time. And here is the number that no one expected. The real RMS Titanic, completed in 1912, cost about $7.5 million to build, which translates to roughly $150 million in today's money, still $50 million less than the film. Cameron had made a movie that cost more than the actual ship it was about. The scale of the production was genuinely staggering. The team meticulously recreated the ship's interiors, consulting with historians and utilizing original blueprints. Cameron refused to have the wallpaper painted on, requiring actual wallpaper. The silverware bore the White Star Line emblem. The carpeting was sourced from the same manufacturer that had originally supplied the Titanic. The facility built for the film was so large that a zoning system had to be implemented to prevent crew from getting lost within the set. When the studios suggested cutting an hour from Cameron's 3-hour cut to save money, Cameron reportedly replied that they would have to fire him, and that if they wanted to fire him, they would have to kill him. He forfeited his $8 million director's fee and his share of initial gross profits to keep the film intact. Every entertainment analyst in Hollywood predicted catastrophe. The word in the trades was that Titanic would be the Heaven's Gate of the 1990s, a career-ending vanity disaster that would lose hundreds of millions of dollars. Every single one of them was wrong. There is one behind-the-scenes story from the making of this film that sounds so bizarre it almost seems invented. Almost. On the night of August 8, 1996, the Titanic crew was wrapping their work in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they had been filming the modern-day framing sequences. A craft services crew provided clam chowder that happened to be spiked with PCP. Within an hour of the meal, people were moaning and crying, wailing, collapsed on tables and gurneys. The director of photography, Caleb Deschanel, was leading a number of crew members down the hall of the hospital in a highly vocal conga line. Grips were doing wheelies in wheelchairs. James Cameron recalled the incident years later, saying, quote, You can't make this stuff up. Nearly 80 people were taken to the hospital. The Halifax Regional Police investigated the incident. To this day, despite investigations, the culprit behind the PCP-spiked chowder remains unknown. Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet were not on the Canadian set, and so they were spared. Cameron and Bill Paxton were not so lucky. Cameron found himself experiencing anxious and hallucinogenic effects, fearing he had ingested paralytic shellfish neurotoxin. The greatest maritime disaster film in history, made by a man obsessed with control, nearly came apart because someone laced the soup. To this day, no one has ever been charged. Speaking of casting, there is a version of this story in which none of it looks the way we remember it. DiCaprio originally refused to read for the part of Jack during a screen test. Cameron told him, quote, "You're going to read or you're not going to get the part." DiCaprio arrived for the screen test with what Cameron described as every ounce of his being radiating negativity, right up until the moment Cameron said action, at which point he became Jack Dawson, completely and instantly. Matthew McConaughey auditioned for the role with Kate Winslet and walked away from the session feeling confident he had the part. He never got the call. McConaughey's steadfast Southern accent didn't fit Cameron's vision for the character, and his refusal to alter it sealed the decision. There were other contenders. Gwyneth Paltrow was considered for Rose. Jeremy Sisto screen-tested alongside Winslet. Winslet herself called Cameron on a freeway, told him she absolutely had to be part of this, and that he would be out of his mind not to cast her. That kind of fierce, unsolicited lobbying, combined with the chemistry she had with DiCaprio from the very first scene they read together, is what made the film what it was. And here is one small detail about that film that most people have never thought about. The hand you see sketching Rose in the famous drawing scene is not Leonardo DiCaprio's hand. Cameron himself is an accomplished illustrator, and the hand seen in the scene belongs to him. Because DiCaprio is right-handed and Cameron is left-handed, the shots had to be mirror-imaged in post-production to maintain the illusion. Now let's talk about what James Cameron invented, what he changed, and what he got exactly right, because the balance is more complex than most viewers realize. The third-class passengers being locked below decks, unable to access the upper levels while the ship sank, is one of the most emotionally potent images in the film. That scene is entirely fictional. The crew's focus was solely on saving lives, without discrimination. It was based on class. That doesn't mean class didn't matter that night, because the survival statistics tell a story that is hard to argue with. But the specific image of gates being locked and poor passengers being deliberately trapped below is a dramatization, not a documented fact. The character of First Officer Murdoch, shown shooting passengers and then himself in the chaos, caused real grief and outrage in the Scottish town, where Murdoch was born and celebrated as a hero. While witness testimony suggests that an officer did commit suicide, it cannot be said with absolute certainty that it was Murdoch, and there is no evidence to suggest that Murdoch ever took a bribe. The studio flew to Murdoch's hometown and issued an apology, making an $8,500 donation to Murdoch's memorial fund. Some things Cameron got precisely, almost painfully right. The elderly couple seen lying together on their bed as water floods the room is directly inspired by the real story of Isidore and Ida Strauss. Isidore was the co-owner of Macy's department store. Ida was offered a spot in a lifeboat and refused it. She handed her fur coat to her maid, told her to take her place, and stayed beside her husband. She told him, quote, "We have been living together for many years. Where you go, I go." The two sat together in deck chairs and waited for the ocean to come. Only Isidore's body was found. It is one of the most documented and verified moments from that night, and the film renders it without embellishment because none was needed. Then there is the band. The ship's 8 hired musicians had never performed together before the voyage. Their leader was violinist Wallace Hartley, 33 years old, who had worked before for the Cunard Line, before leaving his fiancée to accept the job on the Titanic. When panic broke out among the passengers, They assembled in the first-class lounge to play in an effort to keep everyone calm. As the ship continued to plunge, the band moved to the forward half of the boat deck and continued playing, even when their doom became apparent. All 8 of them died that night. The final song they played has been debated for over a century. Some survivors said it was the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others said the band played ragtime music and a popular waltz called Songe d'automne. The historical record does not offer a definitive answer. What is not in dispute is that they kept playing. A second-class passenger later wrote that many brave things were done that night, but none were more brave than those done by men playing minute after minute. As the ship settled quietly, lower and lower in the sea, Cameron's film uses the hymn version, adapted from a 1958 British film called A Night to Remember, and takes the emotional register of that choice seriously. Whether it is historically precise or not, the spirit of it is entirely true. Almost 2 weeks after the Titanic sank, Wallace Hartley's body was recovered, fully dressed and with his violin case strapped to his body. A silver engraving on Hartley's German-made violin reads, "For Wallace, on the occasion of our engagement, from Maria, 1910. That violin, recovered from the body of a man who chose to play until the water took him, was later sold at auction. It fetched £900,000, a world record sum for Titanic memorabilia." There are details from that night that the film does not have room for, details that change the texture of how you imagine it. The life vests passengers wore were made of rigid cork blocks, and when men and women jumped from the height of the ship's upper decks into the freezing water below, the force of impact drove those stiff cork panels violently upward against the neck. The result was fractured vertebrae, cervical dislocations, injuries sustained not from the cold, but from the very equipment meant to save them. Many of the people who jumped believing they were giving themselves a chance had already suffered serious injuries before they felt the temperature of the water. It is a detail that almost never appears in dramatizations because it complicates the visual grammar of survival, but it was real, and it made that night even more cruel than any film has fully shown. And then there is the baker. Charles Jochen was the Titanic's chief baker, and he went into the water while holding onto the back rails of the ship, just like he does with Jack and Rose in the movie. And before that, he had snuck back to his room for a drink. He drank what multiple accounts describe as a considerable quantity of whiskey before the ship went under. The North Atlantic that night was at approximately -2 degrees Celsius, a temperature at which unprotected human beings typically succumb to hypothermia within minutes. Jochen survived for hours. The alcohol, according to the historical record and subsequent analysis, appears to have contributed to a physical state that allowed him to endure conditions that should have killed him much faster. He was eventually pulled onto an overturned collapsible lifeboat, and he survived the disaster entirely. He became, in time, one of the most studied cases of survival under extreme cold exposure. A man who accidentally found a way around the mathematics of death because he decided to calm his nerves the way bakers sometimes do. The Renault car that appears in the film's intimate scene between Jack and Rose was a real car that was aboard the actual Titanic, but it was never assembled. The vehicle traveled in pieces, crated up and stored in the cargo hold. No gleaming automobile waiting in the ship's lower decks. No curved metal catching the light of a lantern. Nothing like the romantic setting Cameron constructed on screen. And Molly Brown, the indomitable survivor, played in the film by Kathy Bates and depicted with great energy and determination, was carrying a small ancient Egyptian artifact called a ushabti in her coat during the sinking. Ushabtis are funerary figurines from the tombs of ancient Egypt, designed to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Why Molly Brown had one on her person during a transatlantic crossing in 1912 is a question that has never been fully answered. The object survived the night alongside her, and it sits today in a museum, a relic from a civilization thousands of years old that witnessed in the pocket of a remarkable woman one of the defining catastrophes of the 20th century. Now we have to address the theories, because no discussion of Titanic is complete without them, and some of them are genuinely worth examining before they are taken apart. The most persistent conspiracy around the sinking involves the creation of the United States Federal Reserve. The theory holds that the Titanic was deliberately sunk to eliminate three powerful millionaires who opposed the creation of a central bank. The targets, according to this version of history, were John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, three of the wealthiest men aboard, all supposedly fierce opponents of centralized banking. Their elimination, the theory suggests, cleared the political path for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The story has all the right ingredients for a conspiracy. Powerful institutions, secret agendas, conveniently timed deaths, and a world historical outcome following closely after. But it collapses almost immediately under factual scrutiny. Isidor Straus, one of the men supposedly murdered for opposing the Federal Reserve, was in fact sympathetic to its creation. His documented political and economic positions do not match the theory. Without the claimed unanimous opposition of all three men, the entire architecture of the conspiracy has no foundation. The second major theory claims that the ship that sank was not the Titanic at all, but its sister vessel, the Olympic, which had sustained damage in earlier accidents. According to this version, the White Star Line secretly swapped the ships, sending the battered Olympic to sea, disguised as its new twin, and arranging for it to sink in order to collect a massive insurance payout. The theory sounds elaborate enough to be plausible until you look at the numbers. The insurance on the ship covered only approximately 1/3 of what it would cost to build a replacement. No company engineers a fraud of that complexity, involving the deaths of over 1,500 people, to receive a payout that would not even cover the loss it was supposed to compensate for. The math simply does not work, and without the math working, the motive dissolves. The film itself, the one James Cameron made at the cost of more money than the ship itself required, went on to earn over $2.25 billion worldwide. It won 11 Academy Awards. It was the highest-grossing film in history for 12 years. 2 hours and 40 minutes of the 3-hour film take place during the exact time frame of the sinking itself. Cameron had spent more cumulative time in submersibles visiting the actual wreck than any single original passenger spent aboard the ship. He had gone down there 12 times before the script was finished, driven by something that resisted easy explanation, but that clearly transmitted itself to every frame of the finished film. And now, as promised from the very beginning, the detail that has been waiting at the edge of this entire story. We came in with a necklace, a real sapphire and diamond pendant that inspired the most iconic object in a film that billions of people have seen. We learned about the couple who owned it, about the false names they traveled under, about the love that ended when Henry Morley went into the North Atlantic and Kate Phillips did not. But here is what most people have never considered. Kate Phillips was pregnant when she survived. She came ashore carrying not only the pendant but a child, Henry's daughter, who would be born months later and given the name Ellen. Ellen never knew her father. She grew up with a story her mother may have told only partially, or perhaps not at all. She inherited a piece of jewelry whose history was weighted with a grief and a secret that the family has guarded for over a century. There is no museum exhibit for this story. There is no documentary that has gotten close to it. There is a family somewhere in the world who carries all of this quietly. And there is a necklace that has never been shown on a screen, that has never been appraised or auctioned or displayed under glass, that is simply there, held by people who understand that some things belong to the people who lost them, not to the world that wants to watch. The film gave billions of people an experience. The real story gave one family an inheritance they never asked for. Both of those things are true, and neither one cancels the other out. What the Titanic keeps demonstrating, more than a century after the ship went down, is that it is not a story with edges. Pull at any thread, and you find another, and then another. A ship that was supposed to be unsinkable. A film that was supposed to be a disaster. A necklace that was supposed to end up in a museum. None of it went where anyone predicted, which is maybe the oldest and most honest thing the Titanic has to say about the nature of fate. Which part of this hit you hardest? The real couple behind the necklace? The chaos of a drugged film crew in Nova Scotia? The men who played their instruments until the water reached them? Leave it in the comments, and if someone in your life needs to know these stories, share this video with them. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because there are more stories like this one waiting, and the best ones are always the ones no one thought to tell you.